Ravi Sundaram begins a chapter of his recent book on Delhi's media urbanism by recounting narratives of ordinary deaths on the road, voiced through fiction, journalistic reportage, and personal experience. The site is mundane, but gruesome. This minor incident in a city of millions provides for Ravi a pressure point for illuminating the significant transformations in the Indian city during the past 20 or so years. These shifts in the range of cultural, political, and architectural landscapes cannot be understated. Discourse on the urban was itself relatively scant in India until the past 10 years, as the rural and the industrial were the privileged sites of progress in the nationalist imaginary. In many ways, the experience of the urban was elided in most scholarship on South Asia more generally in the years following independence in 1947, and architectural discourse was, in a sense, no exception, with a few notable exceptions. And Ravi has been at the forefront of efforts to constitute new sites of discourse around the experience of the city. In 1998, Ravi founded the Sarai program within the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi, itself a prestigious research institute. Sarai was conceived as a platform that reflected the spirit of its moniker. The Sarai, or Caravanserai, was historically a critical stopover point on the roads that traverse Central and South Asia. It was a place that travelers took shelter, where strangers met and interfaced. Sarai quickly became an important space for researchers, filmmakers, and artists young and old to interact and exchange under the wide umbrella of Sarai's concerns over media and the city, organizing conferences, workshops, media programming, installations, and a reader series spanning concerns such as new regimes of intellectual property, cinema, architecture, and the public domain. Sarai has been a prolific node in a burgeoning discourse around the new landscape of the city in South Asia. That a minor event such as a road accident becomes an important protagonist in this narrative of contemporary Delhi is telling Ravi's own perspective. Much like Sarai, the infrastructure at play is thought of as an interface or feedback loop, where subjects and things are in constant exchange and interaction with each other. The architecture of the road, the mechanics of the scooter, the bus, the cell phone, the crowd, the victim, the news report all constitute a thick assemblage of responses and affects that are, ultimately, crucial sites where urban imaginaries are produced. The slippages that are entailed here between subjects and objects are important in where they locate transformation in both the architectural and cultural landscapes of the city. If urban reformers past and present saw the centrally realized master plan as a critical mode of catalyzing transformation in the city, here transformation is notated through the kind of dispersed and viral feedback loops of the city. In many ways, to see transformation in this way refocuses long-standing debates about urbanism and architecture in the third world more generally that have been locked in a kind of dialectics of tradition and modernity, vernacular and cosmopolitan, and so forth. Ravi is currently a visiting faculty at the University of Michigan, where I think he has a joint appointment in the architecture programs and South Asian studies, and has taught previously at Princeton University. Besides directing the Sarai program in Delhi, he also teaches history and theory at the School of Planning and Architecture in Delhi, and has published his work widely. So it brings me a lot of joy to actually welcome Ravi to our community here and have him share his work. It's really been influential on my own work, and I think a whole generation of young researchers, artists, filmmakers, I mean the whole gamut, who are really thinking about how the South Asian city and the kind of third world city more generally is actually produced. In some ways, we're all kind of responding to a frustration over these, I think, existing paradigms of discourse that are given to us. Again, these kind of divisions between the traditional and the modern, et cetera, which in some ways are not very useful categories for us anymore. So with that, I'd like to welcome Ravi Sundaram.
Thank you, Kurt. I'm delighted to be here, really delighted. I've heard so much about RISE, and I know of the architecture program. I read works produced by it. I mean, many years ago as a student, I read the first of the texts that was produced, Kulas Talking to Students. So I'm extremely happy to be here, and thank you, Kurt. What I'm going to do today, as you will realize very quickly, I'm not an architect by training. I'm a scholar, I'm an academic of cities, and I work on media and cities, is actually set up some provocations. And I'm going to set up certain provocations using a few images, a film clip, and that ultimate modernist horror, which is a text. So you'll have to bear with me, and I'll try and work through the provocations, because I think this is in many ways, it's a wonderful moment and a terrifying moment for all of us working on cities. It's wonderful because many of the formulations of modernist design and 19th century social theory are up in the air. I think they are under greater disturbance than ever before. And wonderful also because from Asia's electric universe, we can observe with a mixture of delight and maybe fear the long beginning of an era of Western hegemony and power from the time of the Crusades. And from Asia, I think we can see that the time has come. But I think, like all such storms, and it is a storm we are living through, like all such storms, the current one threatens many of the secure concepts from the 19th century. The idea of the social, its designation, the place of the city in which all of us invest in. And most interestingly for me personally, the difference between the sphere designated as that of the media and that of the social. It is that designative difference which mixes in urban life, which has imploded. So my story today has two parts. The first looks at the legacy of modernist planners in the tropics in the post-colonial periods of the 1950s and 1960s. The second, which is really the meat of the presentation, is the clear collapse of these modernist models by the 1980s in the post-colonial world, and the arrival of a mix of urban proliferation and media proliferation. And these move beyond the old designations of the plan and the law. So this proliferation, media and urban proliferation, combine in a kind of wild urbanism. It's really a wild urbanism that absolutely has no representational reference in the archive of Western modernism. So in this sense, media, contemporary media, has surely changed the experience of the city, no doubt about it. A lot of architecture is in debate with that. But I think it subverts fundamentally the project of the post-colonial era in ways we could never imagine before. So my examples today are really from the city in which I live, Delhi. It's a city of 17 million. It's now the largest city in the country. It's surpassed Bombay. But I think Delhi's transition from really a quiet city to a frenetic urbanism, which is where it is today, images many similar transitions all over the world, outside the historic West, which, as I said, is moving into a sphere of long crisis now. Writing just 2 years after the Paris events of 1968, Henri Lefebvre came up with a bold hypothesis. And the events had just happened, so he writes this incredible book, short, cryptic book almost, called The Urban Revolution. And this is from his introduction. And Lefebvre says, society has been completely urbanized, unquote. By this, Lefebvre meant that the urban condition had replaced the questions of the city and its secret script, as he said. And what is the secret script? The map and the plan. The designative oppositions of the 19th century, of 20th century urbanism, urban versus rural, industry versus agriculture, order versus chaos, were all up in the air, says Lefebvre, after the urban condition. From now on, urban practices would replace the clear language of designation. So writing after 68, he says, fresh after 68, the era of designation is over. Now, in the immediate years of the post-colonial period, modern urban planners in India initiated precisely those designations that Lefebvre claimed would become irrelevant after the 1960s. Planning modernism in India initiated a significant transformation of colonial urban design, influenced mostly by international style modernism in its Cold War US variant. The most advanced version of this was the planning of Delhi in the 1950s by US urbanists, a project that would later extend to Calcutta. And Calcutta in the 1960s was the largest urban planning project in the world. It was incredible. Everyone whom you would refer to was involved in it. The 1950s saw a new tribe of modernist planners and architecture adventurers who ventured on newly independent worlds like modernized versions of 19th century European travelers. Corbusier in Chandigarh, Doxiadis in Islamabad, Buckminster Fuller in Africa and India, all represented this tribe. And I think there were echoes of this even in Costa Nemeire's design for Brasilia. Pushed by local regimes to set up showcase cities, even by US and Soviet foreign policy coffers, architect travelers were in fact on the sidelines of a significant urban transformation initiated by less known urban planners and designers who worked to plan and develop actually existing cities with large populations: Delhi, Lagos, Beijing, Calcutta, Bombay. As we know, the Soviets were involved in Beijing, and the Soviets would be influenced by the ring plan of Moscow in the 1930s. So all these transitions are taking place in the 50s by lesser known people. Now, the Delhi experiment, it was an experiment and a surgical intervention, was reflected, I think, debates begun in the US in the 1920s. And this debate is fairly familiar. From the late 1920s, Lewis Mumford and Clarence Stein attacked what they saw as the inhumanity of the 19th century city and called for active decentralization. Now, for the regionalists, centralization had promoted the domination of an urban elite, produced congestion, overcrowding, and a sorry state of affairs. According to the regionalists, technologies of travel and infrastructure, automobility, electricity grids, made the case for a network of decentralized new towns, green areas, open spaces, run by decentralized new communities. Now, versions of regionalism played a key role in the Delhi master plan, put in place by Albert Mayer and the American experts in the 1950s. Mayer was a well-known New York City planner, good friend of Mumford, and an architect who actually did the first master plan for Chandigarh, which Corbusier ended up using. And Mayer was close to Nehru. The master plan for Delhi was actively funded by the Ford Foundation, which saw in Delhi a possible non-communist alternative to urban conflict and backwardness. So the Americans were in Delhi, the Soviets were in Beijing. Now, so the American planners arrived, and they had to actually deal with the legacy of colonial design by Edward Lutyens and George Baker, who designed the capital after 1911. Now, this is the first plan for Delhi, the imperial plan. So the planners had to deal with the legacy of Lutyens and Baker. Lutyens' design was a mobilization of the ceremonial power of the empire over the colonized, with a subtle incorporation of local influences. The urban form was based on an elevational display of the Viceroy's house in Kingsway. If you see, I usually don't like pointing. This is where it is. And a clear separation from the Mughal city and its traditions. A hierarchy of class and status was mediated through a combination of dispersed garden city design and Baroque monumentality. Vast empty spaces were included to give the maximum exposure to colonial power and ceremony. New Delhi emerged as the city of the empire all over the world, where the volatile tropical nativisms were absorbed by a paternal universalism. In the 1950s, the US planners for Delhi moved a little differently. What the master plan, the US design master plan's design attempted to do was to deflect migration flows to suburban nodes, while at the same time, and this is the important part of the discussion, displacing forms of life that were not considered sufficiently urban from the main city. In doing so, the master plan sought to build a defensible urban core defensible urban code, cemented by law, a highly centralized command structure to address the demand of the regime for political control. So here's the paradox. These are progressive designers from New Deal designers who arrive in Delhi, funded by the Ford Foundation with a clear kind of subtle political purpose. They have access to Nehru, and they actually end up with a law that nationalizes land in Delhi. So all land is nationalized. This is the model. The land should be cut off from speculation, the control of the state, and there should be clear. And what they did, as you shall see, this is a fairly standard. So this is the core, and this is the land use plan in which they separate through the master plan designations of the city. It's a radical transformation of the urban form where the regions would absorb forms of migration, and as we shall see, they designated spheres of the city where, and mostly outside the city, where people who were not considered urban enough, they had a typology of what is urban, had to go. It's a kind of apartheid. This was a model of the machine city drawn from US urbanism, whose debates had nurtured the 1962 master plan's international consultants. This was centrifugal space, decentralized urbanism, held together mainly by the infrastructures of motor transport and communication. The decentralized centrifugal city, as the new machine model for urbanism, became the modernizing slogan of planners for the coming decades, Delhi included. It was the perfect escape from the old city form, including here, condemned as congested and unlivable. But the plan, I think, went further. It sought, again, to designate a life that was in fact urban. And this was really a puzzle in the 1950s. What was the post-colonial urban subject? And these were debates taking place everywhere. Now, in 1962, in a long article inaugurating the launch of the master plan, the Sunday Delhi Hindustan Times suggested, and I quote, "If Delhi is to be planned into a well-integrated city and to be maintained, it needs inhabitants with a primarily urban psychology," unquote. Seen here through a distilled modernization theory and sociology, the urban psyche produced specific practices of living, work, and community. Such social types were to be nurtured through planning practices and technologies of control and management. Debates of unurban practices involved slum activists, US planners, and the Indian elite. What you have here is a very bad photograph, because that's the only one that's in the archives, of a photograph from the typology studies they did of urban and rural personalities, where they had 17 pilot projects in Delhi, and they were interviewing people and trying to find out what is urban, what is not urban, what form of work is urban, what form of work is not urban. This is a typology of a non-urban. It's actually a working class slum in Delhi, and these people are probably as urban could be. But there's a typology of the village which is, put in the photograph, as you can see. So planning solution here, planners demonstrated unurban practices, low sanitation literacy, animal rearing, and the continuation of noxious industries and practices. So planning solution was surgical. The removal of persons practicing what they called village-like trades to urban villages outside the city. So by law, people like this had to leave the city. Anything that was considered an unurban practice had to leave the city. So they had a kind of taxonomy. So to quote the master plan, such practices cast an unhealthy influence on the urban setting. It destroyed what was the urban form. And it's very interesting, the Ford Foundation at that time was funding similar projects in the US for a racially assimilated city. So they were funding projects in the 50s in India, they were funding projects in the US, they were funding projects in Europe. Because there was whole concern over what a working class neighborhood is, it's not moving into a real city. So all this is happening all over the world. In India, the concern was village-like forms were permeating and destroying an urban personality. So what I'm arguing is that the master plan did not simply put in place a wrong design that was widely believed to have failed by the 1980s. Everyone said it failed by the 1980s. I think the plan's important innovation was to set in motion an implicit idea of the city as a machine, and this is the first post-colonial move, which is regulated by a technocratic apparatus. This idea of the machine city worked with a schema of decentralization with cellular neighborhoods, zoning, district centers, factory areas regulated by law. This was not Corbusier's machine for living, but a very significant modernization. In the 1950s, US urban planners were stressing not just that decentralization would be appropriate for urban density, but best appropriate for dealing with threats of nuclear war. In the American variant, the decentralized city drew from cybernetic models where urban management would draw from information patterns and computer modeling. Mark Wigley has written about this, and Ed Dimmenberg's book, he actually has a citation of Albert Meyer, who was involved in the planning of Delhi, goes back, gets involved in the planning for New York in the context of a nuclear war. So there's a lot of traffic moving back and forth. So it's a kind of international post-colonial moment which is often not looked at because people look at the canonical events, which is Corbusier and Chandigarh. And Chandigarh was really a kind of tabula rasa, where Nehru could do what he wanted. People who worked with actually existing cities had to work with the flesh of the living. But this world, which is the stable management of sovereignty for those in power, the representational architecture for those who had power in the post-colony, producing an urban type, a clear plan with designation, this world would come apart. Not just in Delhi, not just in India, but I think in most parts of the post-colonial world. The very forces that the technocratic machine sought to contain now actively rebounded on that after 1980. Economic proliferation, the horror of economic proliferation outside the law, urban sprawl, non-legal manufacture and commerce, and migrant flows into the city. That whole machinic skin that you saw, which sought to contain this, exploded. The very infrastructures that represented the plan's modernity, electricity, roads, water, health, pollution, became public sites of conflicts about the city. These conflicts were enmeshed, and this is where I come to the second part of the story, in media infrastructures, strategies, and techniques. This scenario is not unique to Delhi, but rebounds across the post-colonial world, where post-war planning regimes have collapsed, serially collapsed, in the face of failed economic models. Now, the public debate has been cluttered by a series of responses, often at odds with each other. For the old planners, the urban transformations suggest a crippled national sovereignty. For a range of Western and Indian Orthodox radicals, it marks a retreat to the state. For modernism in general, that really giddy atmosphere in all of us, which all of us live in, for modernism in general, the new urban is a catastrophic reversal of the critical possibilities of the 20th century. So this is where we come to the second part, which I call the dilemma of proliferation. What happens when things do not conform to designation? In an essay penned more than 20 years ago, Jonathan Crary declared that by the late 1960s, and I quote, "The legibility of the Western city appeared near the threshold of oblivion," unquote. Beset by crisis, the Western city became a product of networks and the excess of speed and circulation, bypassing all plans to give the urban a coherent shape. For Crary, urban theory sought to desperately, quote, impose spatial intelligibility to a locale that was being transformed by the anti-territoriality of capital, unquote. Crary's insight, in a sense, has proved accurate. In the advanced metropolitan centers, a significant allegory of urban crisis has been that of infrastructural decline. I've lived, New Jersey is a good example. Imaging empty peripheral landscapes of former industrial areas. I'm staying near Detroit now, and it's a good image, which act as backends to the endless urban sprawl. The old modernist models of the productive industrial city have long disappeared. Their debris now clutters the landscapes of rust as dystopian afterlives. Today, the verdict, I think, is mostly unanimous among Western modernist scholars that the last decades of the 20th century are witnessing the depressing closure of those very utopian sites of 1920s modernism What we have are the dispersal of the city and its critical possibilities. In the endless landscape of the post-urban sprawl, media corporations and globalized networks rule. A vast hyperspace has destroyed the capacity to reflect on capitalist modernity, or as Frederick Jameson says, and he puts it in his early critique of postmodernism, the ability to map the city cognitively. By contrast, this is a real puzzle. That's why I'm talking of the electric atmosphere of Asia, and one could even refract it to parts of Africa and Latin America. The post-colonial scenario of the past few decades has seen the implosion of urban life. The expansion of new cities has made classic management options simply inoperative. Endless proliferation marks the new post-colonial urban. Home workshops, markets, hawkers, small factories, large and small settlements of the working poor are now spread across and beyond the planned metropolis, or in regions where it was impossible to do so a few years ago. So productive, non-legal proliferation is now here. It's now here to stay. And it's emerged as a defining crisis, a part of the crisis today, urban crisis today. So informality is designated as expressive of this proliferation, and this informality debate is actually started by the ILO economists in the early 1970s. And most people are talking about it. Informal work and settlement lacked government sanction, we know this, rapidly drawing in the new migrant poor, the street traders, small workshops, and neighborhood factories. What emerged, and this is what is really interesting, is informality's ambivalence about the law. Informality works to tenure rather than title. So the whole logic of planning doesn't work. What is interesting for us is that informality emerges from the smaller academic and policy debates in the 1970s to become a form of life that took center stage in the dramaturgy of urban crisis in India and many parts of the post-colonial world. For state planners, neoliberal civic groups, orthodox Marxists, the old secular elite, informality became a model of wild, lawless urbanism that made a mockery of zoning. Lacking in civic services, these zones emerged in civic reports as hellish sites of polluting industries, theft of civic services, and political vote banks. Informality was urbanism out of joint, a frightening outside of the law of the city. This was the shrill discourse that I have lived through in the last 10 years. What is interesting is, if you look beyond this discussion, is informality really helped transform post-colonial cities into media cities, a tag typically reserved for the global city. From the late 1970s, various combinations of media consumption, circulation, and production have rapidly expanded in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Cassette and television culture have now given way to digital media with a cultural morphology that does not simply replicate forms of corporate and state control. So what you have are post-colonial cities that are vibrant hubs for media production. And this produces a media experience that assumes constant breakdown, recycled assemblages, and serial dispersal. What I want to do is show you a small clip from a movie, which is a very interesting avant-garde movie, this is a story which is called No Smoking, and gives you a sense of this world I'm talking about. It's by this avant-garde filmmaker in Bombay, Anurag Kashyap, and I'm not happy about the film, but this is a very interesting clip. This is a bourgeois stock trader who's trying to quit smoking, and the only way he can quit smoking is go to Dharavi, which is one of Asia's largest slums, where he meets this cult, which can actually, it's a kind of therapeutic reversal. So he goes, and he's actually making a trip, and through him you enter the story of this bourgeois trader who's living in a high-rise apartment overlooking the city, actually going in. It's a mixture of Nosferatu. You'll see it now. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about. I don't know if you can get the sound. This is Dharavi. It's a huge production site, as you can see.
Can you pause it for 1 second? the mic out? Oh, that's the headphone jack.
Sorry. So, Dharavi is one of the biggest production centers in India for suitcases, international commodities, some of the things you have bought made in India were actually produced in Dharavi. So, this is typical of Okay. So what do you have in this? Is in a sense what happens in this film is actually the kind of blurring of these worlds. The high and the low, of course, heaven and hell, and the sense of what was designated as a slum. I mean, it's a slum, but it's a highly productive space, hugely productive yet fearful. This blurring of boundaries is even alluded filmically if you saw those levels in which are blurring. I think this, in a sense, gives you a sense of the crisis. It's very difficult to capture creatively. Cinema has the power to do that. And for architects, there's some interesting architects who are working here. It's even more interesting to enter this productive space beyond designation. But what I'm interested in is what the media does to a place like this. And this mixing of urban life and media life beyond designation is what opens up the discussion. Walter Benjamin's suggestion in the 1920s that the collective is also corporeal intimated the mix of image, technology, and urban experience that has defined contemporary cities. Benjamin's idea of a corporeal urban experience suggested an increasing entanglement of body and technology, where city dwellers process a range of shock-like stimuli, develop disciplining techniques to deal with distraction, as well as tactile, playful appropriations of the rush of images. The dramatic live experience brought about by flickering of film, television, advertising, and mobile screens also disperses space, giving birth to new clusters that often bypass linear networks of cultural and technological change. In the context of post-colonial South Asia, in this context where the media and urban boom have coincided in recent years, technological culture has become implicated in a wider theater of boom culture and urban conflict. Now, this process began really in the 1980s. It began in India, it began to some extent in Mexico, it began in parts of Africa. When the economy began a process of liberalization and deeper integration with the world economy. This process significantly blurred lines between the media and the urban experience for millions of city dwellers in India. In contrast to the earlier decades, the 1990s opened up tactile media. Low-cost computers, advertising, mobile phones, digital images have transformed urban life. The development of new elite suburbia, which most people tend to talk about, notwithstanding that, media urbanism, for the most part, lacks the spectacular force of its Western or East Asian counterparts. Continuous immersion in a world of low-cost media forms is the norm. This media sensorium is often experienced in mixed spaces, low-cost video players in working-class areas running makeshift movie theaters. The evaporation of the boundary between technology and urban life, this evaporation of this boundary has produced a kinetic city, a delirious disorientation of the senses, all happening in a decade. And it's very difficult to imagine that. It's this compression. It's as if every epoch in the history of Western urbanism and media history has been compressed in one decade, which lacks representation. It's a complete disorientation of the senses, and I was a witness to that. The older categories of the city, the social, the political, the cultural, the separation of humans and machines have all been subject to extreme strain and transformation. This is the phenomenon, produces the phenomenon, the collapse of the plan, the mixing of the medial and the urban, the escape from designation, production outside the law, one by one. I'm giving you a crude taxonomy. All these forms merge into this constellation that I call pirate modernity. What is pirate modernity? Piracy works typically through digital and mechanical reproduction, but it becomes a life of its own. A media form, piracy also became a larger mode of replication for low-cost urban technological infrastructure. The world of piracy ranges from not just immaterial goods of all kinds, software, movies, music, hardware, but also most mass market commodities, ranging from the counterfeit to the unbranded, the grey market or local community. Pirate culture has utilized the technological infrastructures of the post-colonial city, electricity, squatter settlements, roads, media networks, factories. These are siphoned off or accessed through informal arrangements outside the legal arrangements of the city. By disrupting existing technologies of control and expansion, piracy provides a key interface between media technologies and larger urban infrastructures. In this sense, my own work is in harmony with emerging work in Latin America, parts of China by a whole new generation, and parts of Africa. Dramatically increased access to urban technological infrastructures, weaker bourgeois institutions, and political mobilization by the poor provides a key context of pirate modernity. With its location in economic urban proliferation and media technologies of reproduction, piracy attracts subaltern populations out of place in the contemporary city. Piracy's indifference, studied indifference to property laws, produced a significant resource for subaltern populations unable to enter the legal city. Pirate culture, and this is the paradox, pirate culture presumes and further expands the experience of the technological at a time when the boundaries of the technological and urban have evaporated or become blurred. So this blurring of the cultural and the technological has produced a vitalistic urban sensorium, dream worlds of consumption and spectacle that we know about, confusions of the natural and artificial that we also know about, and most significantly in a post-colonial context, the terrifying enhancements of death and tragedy in a mediatized world. Terrifying enhancements, all happening very quick. Remember this, the entire archive, the urban archive and the media archive compressed in 1 decade. Try and imagine that as an experience. This is piracy's great aporia, great terrifying aporia. Even as it created radical conditions of possibility for subaltern populations in the city, it brought them to the edge of permanent technological visibility, and the visceral circuits of media industries. In many ways, piracy's strength was its ability to innovate and proliferate and disperse when attacked by new enforcement regimes in the 1990s. The informationalization of the post-colonial urban economy, you saw an example of that in the film, provides a key reference in this. International control technologies, computerized land records, GIS city maps, biometric IDs, some of these things I'm working on right now, were initiated to make pirate modernity legible to property. In turn, informational protocols were continuously broken. They were produced and then they were broken, counterfeited and bypassed by pirate modernity. Bypass strategies are very high for media goods, where movement was easy, very quick and easy. In short, informationalization, which is now being undertaken all over India and many parts of the so-called South after 9/11, digital IDs, GIS maps, trying to solve the crisis of representation. I think it's a hydra. Things are set up and things are broken. So piracy, in a sense, is not an alterity. It's not a form of resistance, though it clearly offers creative solutions outside the property regime. But piracy disrupts control in the context of a property regime that has no space for it. In short, pirate modernity may be seen as globalization's illicit and unacknowledged expression. So what I'm arguing is that post-colonial media urbanism, and this is a media urbanism, has generated a whole new series of situations that fundamentally prevent a recall of the modernist questions of the 20th century. Populations are well moved beyond being seen as recipients of media in cinema halls, radio sets, and television. This scenario, a staple of much of 20th century European modernity, based itself on the experiences of initial shock and distraction, and increasingly technologized cities, Benjamin, Krakow, the whole debates in the 1920s. Populations now participate as part producers, we all produce media, part consumers and proliferators of media. At one level, media and cultural industries are crucial, but people proliferate all the time. What happens to the old modernist urban archive in this context? The old modernist urban archive of the 20th century produces the dualisms of the plan and counterplan, public and private, control and resistance. Pirate modernity has no clear representational language, but a series of mutating situations. It emerged as a pragmatic appropriation of the city, perhaps more media-res than marginal. Pirate modernity does not easily fit classic representations of the political, the resistance, the tactical, the marginal, the multitude, or the movement. The 20th century European avant-garde dreamed of transforming colonized everyday life into a festival. Pirate modernity ignores the redemptive cast of the early avant-garde or of many subsequent political movements. That's why I'm saying, imagine a form that has no reference in the Western archive. It's very difficult to do that. When I've spoken at art events, people say, is it an avant-garde? It's not an avant-garde. So fundamental is this move that it involves a significant rearrangement of the technologies of urban management that post-colonial societies have known after colonialism. Now, post-colonial governmental policies were based on a careful separation of the spheres of the social and the spheres of the media. The social was the sphere of welfare and community and planners and designers, urban designers. Mass media existed in the realm of leisure, nurture, and cultural policy. And this was in line with most global policy. By the 1990s, these spheres have got so mixed up, so fundamentally mixed up, that boundary confusions, which we know of from theory in the West, were rampant. Courts, governments had to deal with this every day. I'll give you an example, one very interesting example. What happened from the mid-1990s is the amplification of sound. With digital instruments that were amplifying sound, it was happening all over Asia. So new instrumentations were coming in that were increasing sound levels in the streets. And those of you who know urban history in the US, and this great book, The Soundscapes of Modernity by Emily Thompson, she talks of the 20s in New York, how sound was regulated by case law, urban case law, and planning. But what happened in the 90s was that whole architecture of case law in India, and I imagine many just collapsed. Because everyone was buying these loud instruments, people were partying in the street, religious festivals were amplifying sound, namaz, Muslims who had namaz, loudspeakers. So conflict was breaking out at every level. It's the amplification of the senses at every level. So you have a street which is highly amplified, right? So you have a situation in which noise moves from the controlled and manageable spaces of reception, cinema halls, factories, to a situation where media emerge from a public body as if without limits. So the court, the Supreme Court, which was hearing a case, and this case finally goes up to the court, and the court makes a decision. This is what the court says. This is from case law, very boring, dull case law, but it has a theoretical insight. And the court says, noise is a type of atmospheric pollution. It is a shadowy public enemy whose growing menace has increased in the modern age of industrialization and technological advancement. Noise pollution was previously confined to a few special areas like a factory or a mill, but today it engulfs every nook and corner of the globe, reaching its peak in urban areas. So noise has no limits. In suggesting that noise had emerged from the enclosed spaces of the factory to every nook and corner of the globe in the city, what this court decision did, it foregrounded the limits of existing urban technologies of management, mixing things, amplification, and people. In this judgment, the court judgment acting foregrounded, and there were many like this, the confusions between humans and machines, the effects that were designated as human and the effects that were designated as machinic. Where do we go from here theoretically? A few years before his death, Deleuze suggested an update of Foucault's mediations on power and control, many of which had successively gone through the focus on discipline, governmentality, and biopolitics. Deleuze mapped out an important change from disciplinary regimes, which in Foucault's original narrative had replaced the societies of absolutist sovereignty. Now, this is what Deleuze says. Deleuze says new telecommunication networks and flows of information had dislocated what Foucault had called the technologies of confinement, and designation distinctive of disciplinary regimes, include planning. What emerged, and this is a well-known essay that some of you must have seen, were controlled societies, a significant shift from the experience Foucault had described. And now Deleuze says, enclosures are molds, they're molds, distinct castings, but controls, the society he's talking about, are like modulation, constant modulation, a self-deforming cast. that will continuously change from one moment to another, or like a sieve whose mesh will transmute from point to point. Modulation, rather than old style discipline, transforms the rhythm of movement, blurring entry and departure points. This is a nightmare for designation, entry and departure points. Says Deleuze, and I quote, "One is never finished with anything. The corporation, the educational system, the armed services, they are meta-stable states, coexisting in one and same modulation like a gigantic system of deformation. Under societies of control, the short term and the unbounded overtake the disciplinary models of the long term. The individual, the mass, and the signature have been replaced by codes and passwords and data banks. Piracy and counterfeits replace sabotage. Capitalism is no longer confined to factories." And Deleuze, of course, says 19th century capitalism is confined to factories, and now it's spread out. So capitalism, in his opinion, is an old essay, very, very old essay. He says it works through dispersal and debt, rather than discipline as its primary tool. Now, Deleuze's essay is a rough outline, and I'm concluding here. And in his characteristic style, Deleuze is really using Foucault's ideas to bounce off his own. But in his idea of a world that is continuous and without limit, and I'm using Asia and the post-colonial world as a world in which this is being played out most radically, I think Deleuze illuminates the problem of collapsing boundaries of older control technologies. Now, this is by no means an advance over the previous epoch. And Deleuze says, compared with the past epochs, we may even see the old confinement as a happy past. But in this context, and what is important for us as people thinking about the city, the problem of politics or a critical reference outside the modernist archive is fundamental. In many ways, when the first technological transformation had initiated, Walter Benjamin in his artwork essay had raised the same question. Except today, and I'm going back to my opening, it's a wonderful and terrifying moment. It's wonderful because certain limits are open. It's terrifying because we know that a time is coming to an end. And there's always the terror of the unknown. So in this sense, going back to Benjamin, our options are not what he called dream world or catastrophe. Dream world of consumption or the catastrophe of what he called fascism. But I think critically responding, particularly in the post-colony, to a capitalism that mixes technology and life in a city, in a destructive, chaotic expansion. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions. Following the questions, we'll have a small reception in the hallway where we can continue the discussion.
I'm wondering if there's another side of the story that you haven't told, which is a story we told other people about increasing enclaves at the same time as this stuff's going on. And with respect to that question, I'm wondering if you know a project by OMA or Nancy in Malaysia. Do you know this project?
I don't know of it, I've heard of it.
But essentially, the notion is that they set up small islands of control, functional zone, particular psychology buildings, inside what they call a tropical soup, is the term. And the tropical soup is sounding a lot like what you described. And so I guess I'm wondering about how do you think about that sort of approach to this? How would you respond to a project like that, given your
See, I don't know of that project, but I can tell you what the kind of, what is happening is a very interesting scenario, and it's happening a bit in the US, in terms of broader control technologies. When people, they have to actually think on their feet. So what we're doing in Delhi is very interesting, because in India you do have democratic politics. So the minute you have urban concentrations, you have to have elections, you have to have a corporation, there are all these pressures that people have to deal with. So it's a peculiarly different situation. What they're doing in Delhi, I was just telling Kurt about this, is that they are carrying out a massive plan to make a new, the lack of a better word, digital map of Delhi, where they're trying to assemble data sets from all kinds of institutions and also assume that populations, what Foucault called the old population, will produce information about the city. So they'll have, it's quite pathological, they'll have 800 cameras giving live video on the city. When cars pass, they'll be producing data about roads. There's of course seismic material. It'll be linked to transportation hubs, interactive transportation. So it's trying to solve the problem of representation, which is the old map, etc. And they know law is no longer going to work through having this kind of dynamic interface, by assuming you have the eye of the state who's going to look at them, but they also assume that people will produce. And it's a bit like here. We become part of it. But I think I'm doing research on this right now. I have this new project on urban fear, and this is the first part of it. So this is one initiative that they're doing. They want to give everyone a digital ID card with biometric chips, and they're trying to link welfare to that. Because the problem with welfare, the old model of welfare, urban welfare, it was linked to an idea of the social. The poor with a certain line and a space. Now they don't go by space. They go by this biometric ID card linked to a certain history. So everyone's innovating. Just as in the US, it's a kind of war technology and an urban technology that is coming in. So it's not based on enclosure. It's based on a kind of open city post-designation. And it's actually very interesting and also terrifying, I think, at the same time. So every section is being innovated. Welfare is not based on anything else. So these are things that are happening right now. So, and a lot of it is they're learning from the post 9/11 shifts, because software companies that have pitched to the US are pitching there for city representation. This Map company is a company that's also selling software to the Defense Department here. So it's a very complex shifts, I think, are taking place in cities. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Luis. It's a very nice lecture. I have a question of designation, and it is the term that you use in order to somehow represent this new political sensorium emerging within the non-modern city, that is the notion of pirates, or piracy. Because the notion of the pirate is somehow he exists in relation to an established realm of politics, of society, of control, right? He is the hacker of, and by the moment that he is the hacker of, while he works out of the realm, his designation is already one of the expatriates, right? So I'm just wondering why, in this search for an alternative of urban construction that is able to escape moments of designation or of nomination, for that case, you are using the word pirate, because that you're already positioning yourself in a moment of resistance, of something that you actually want to escape. So it's like you're running away, but you're still looking back, right, to that what you belong. Just because you have mentioned so many other aspects, right, like the whole idea of the sensorium that somehow tries to escape those spaces that have still not been monopolized by the urban mapping, by the urban construct. So I'm just asking you if you have some doubts about your own nomination of piracy as the way of looking into a new way of finding ways of constructing cities in a different manner.
Okay. It is everything not that we need to say. It is precisely because in the book and in all my other essays that have been circulated, I argue exactly the opposite. That piracy is not a form of resistance. It's a fundamental, it's an allegory in a Benjaminian sense. It's offering us a window into enter a practice. In this sense, it is not representation. So it's not the Western avant-garde, it's not a form of resistance, it's a practice. It's a practice that it's always escaping. And it moves within different practices. So it's a window into a world. That's a productive world. So you have to think outside the language of the Western avant-garde, which is only of resistance in the political. This is a question I get every time I present. And it's not that, because that is a fundamentally, I think, a problematic language, because it's a problem. It's old language of positioning. It's very problematic. It's a creative practice, and in the book I talk about how it actually brings people into a highly productive space, but also brings them to this terrifying visibility. And it's very important to mix these two elements, and I think for me it's more useful to set up constellations rather than set up a kind of designated site through its resistance, this thing, because that I feel as an urbanist I find it more interesting to work with a site that is, that has a kind of history that one can mine archaeologically. So that's what I'd say. There is no outside, philosophically.
Then just another question within the same framework, right? The moment that you are able to, in this investigation of the piracy of the urban realm, and trying to find all these practices, the moment that you're able to identify them, the moment that you're able to spot them, that you're able to nominate them, to state them, aren't you already, the moment that you make them representable, aren't you instrumentalizing them as a system of power? So the question is, do you think that representation as a system of designation is able to contain states of exception, states of, that move away from politically constrained realms?
I would hope and pray that I do not fall within a representationalist model. I'm philosophically have a problem with that.
Mm-hmm.
And in debates, I have had debates with people where I find that there's one thing, there's no outside. So if one has to work through a particular site and through a particular any constellation, one has to actually work through it archaeologically, historically, in particular time and space, rather than represent it and annex it to not just a subject object, to an avant-garde practice. This is my position, stated position. So I would actually set up these situations. What I've done is I set up these situations. I prefer to do that. I set up these situations and try to work through it. And even in the new work I'm doing on urban fear, where I'm looking at the map, I'm looking at money, I'm looking at the mobile phone photograph, these are sites through which I can actually work through, rather than annex them to a notion of the political. That's why I find it very uncomfortable. All the Western debates on the future of the political, a lot of it makes no sense to me. Makes no sense, because I really see this a debate within Europe. It's a debate within Europe. It's as if a moment has come where, it should be a productive moment where there's a cry from the time of the Crusades, a structure of power is coming to an end. People should actually productively think outside, exactly thinking within it. So I would say we need to open all that up and actually work by setting up these sites, maybe temporary sites, and use it as a way of entering space.
My life I'm wondering, I guess I'm going to pose as a devil's advocate position.
Please.
I'm wondering if your approach, which is based on media, doesn't in fact actually sort of repeat the sociological approach to the city by Albert Lamb, where they look at the city rather than a set of physical objects, but as a sociological, and they look at it sociologically, and look at the village relationships, and said that's the city, therefore it should be good. And I'm wondering if your approach in a media, for instance, that Albert Mayer's approach, that sociological approach for the Ford Foundation in the 20s and 30s in the US, actually came out of Chicago School research based on the notion of the newspaper, and that Robert Park and Lewis Worth and people like that. So I'm wondering if your approach in terms of media doesn't actually preclude the formal aspect of things, the physical aspect of these cities right now. So for instance, the enclosure that we see there, that space.
Okay. Sure. I told this actually in the text. There is. I bring in what you're talking about. This is Nehru Place. It's So I have a discussion on the whole space. So this is one of Asia's biggest media markets. I think the second biggest after Taiwan. It's a decrepit, modernist, business district that was once designed in the 70s. Supposed to be Delhi's. It's completely decrepit. Waters dripping, vibrant, utterly vibrant. So So there's a physical space, there's a physicality to it. You know, so I go through all the reports on the place, the history of the place. We have to do that. When you set up a site, one has to actually work through it, and all of it has a formal, imaginative material. I think I'm all for that. I'm all for a kind of working through that. And
So you differentiate that physical aspect of your work from the notions of representation?
yeah. So it's all about building sites, I think. The way we you know, the kind of elements we mobilize. And that is where the craft of, I think, not just research, but of architecture, of urban interventions comes. And that, for me, that is the most exciting part today. Because this is utterly, you know, you visit this space, when I take, for instance, this place, it's incredible. But most of the most vibrant places are in places like this. Partly when you saw the film, Dharavi is so vibrant because it is hell, but hell is a productive space. You know, this is exactly a Nietzschean kind of, you know, God is dead, but then.
Great, thank you. Please join us.